Welcome back to Creative Questions. Today's episode is a really big deal. Someone I've had on my bucket list of getting on the podcast for a very long time, and it has finally happened. So, podcasting legend, creative legend, we have on the podcast today, Andy J. Pizza. For those of you who don't know, Andy J. Pizza is a New York Times bestselling author-illustrator of many books for children and adults, such as Invisible Things and Pizza with Everything on It. Andy is also the creator of a popular podcast called Creative Pep Talk, which he's been doing it forever. There's so many amazing episodes. So I'm glad to have Andy on today, and I hope you guys enjoy. Here's the episode. How's it going, Andy?
Sweet. It's going pretty good, honestly. Yeah, pretty good.
How's your morning been? Like, what are you up to today?
Well, it's one of those better mornings. I'm trying not to be this all or nothing type of person, but I think it goes with the package of neurodivergence. And if my morning's good, if I can get kind of locked in, then I have a pretty good day. If somehow my brain gets the best of me and I get distracted or get into a weird emotional funk or whatever, I can get really lost real quick.
Yep.
And today just happened to be one of those days where I got up, stayed on task, did a run, got working, and I'm feeling pretty good.
Nice.
So it's one of the better ones.
I will tell you that my morning has been the opposite, because I 100% understand what you mean. Where, like, I was talking to my wife the other day about it. I was like, there are just those mornings that derail me so bad that I'm just left spinning the whole rest of the day, and I'm just trying to catch my footing. But like, we were supposed to go grocery shopping this morning, and I had this right now, and I just did not set enough time to be able to do both, and it was just. I'm like, I'm sorry, babe. I'm gonna have to make it up to you in some way. Like, can you handle? Like, it's
that time optimism.
Yes.
Overly optimistic with time, and you think, you know what? Like, I just feel like doing this little thing is not. It'll help me actually. I'll get into a better zone. Actually, no, get the stuff done. Just get it done. Yeah. And so, anyway, I would say I probably have at least 1 or 2 days a week where it just kind of unravels.
Yes.
So I get you.
Yeah, I feel
you.
Yeah. So I don't know. That's why I was excited to have this conversation, because I'm like, oh, it's nice to talk to someone else who is kind of dealing with that. And I've been freelancing. So again, it's just like all these things where it's like, now you're in control of your time. So how do you optimize it? And I feel like with like freelancing, owning your own business, it's a lot of understanding you. And that's what's so great about it, is like, you got to step back and understand who you are. But that's also the double-edged sword where it does get difficult. I'm excited to kind of get into that conversation. And so I want to kind of kick off. Well, you can start off right there. Where does your journey with ADHD start? When did you first realize that's what you were going through?
I mean, I've kind of made jokes about this in talks and stuff, that like the first time I remember hearing anything about it was like first grade, I think, running around open gym with a buddy of mine, Jeremy. And I'm like, this kid, he's the only one that can keep up. This guy's awesome. I love this guy. And then halfway through open gym, he's like, hey, I got to go take my meds. And I'm like, okay, are you sick or something? He's like, no, I'm just hyper. And I was like, wait, I thought that was being awesome, and you're telling me you need medicine for this? Like, that was the first time I was like, okay, something's weird about that. And then, couple things in high school, and then it wasn't until mid-20s that I started really opening up to the possibility that this is probably a real thing. And then it wasn't until I talked to my doctor, and it was kind of a long journey to even figure out how does one get diagnosed? I don't even know. Who do you talk to? Like, at first when I talked to my doctor and we kind of talked through stuff, I kind of felt like at the time, this was also a time where it was a lot less talked about online. Sure. So I didn't feel like I had as much knowledge or resources around it. And so when I did that those chats with my doctor, I kind of thought like, well, I'm diagnosed because she talked me through it, whatever. And it wasn't until later that I actually, and everybody's journey is different, but it wasn't until later that I went to I think it was a psychologist, and we did the kind of formal diagnosis.
For sure.
And, you know, I'm like the Ash Ketchum of ADHD because I caught them all. I got all the types, and so yeah, and I've got double the requirement of memory deficit to be considered ADHD. So, boom, it is as official as it gets over here. And so yeah, that's kind of those are the facts, I guess, of how it happened.
Yeah, I was talking about, again, my wife has ADHD too, so it's a topic of conversation. And it's like one of those things that I didn't realize until I was like 30. Like, it was during the pandemic, and she was like, I think she knew for a while what I was dealing with. And she was like, you think you want to look into what ADHD is? And I was like, what? Why are you saying this? And so I went and looked, and I was like, I took one of the tests. You know, you go online, you're like, I had everything. I hit every marker. And I was like, dang, okay, that's what, but it was gratifying. Like, I felt like I've struggled for a very long time with like, why can't I stay focused on this book? Like, I really want to read it, but I cannot. And that's just one of the many things. But I've been describing it lately as like being a computer and having like no RAM. You have no RAM to be able to store anything. So it's so
and
difficult.
a web browser with 1,000 tabs open. You know, like and if the cache needs emptied, and there's just no emptying it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Are there any tricks that you have for yourself that kind of get you through? Maybe you're like your top 2 or 3 that you employ, like maybe every day.
Yeah. You know, I think I definitely do, and sometimes I feel like I struggle so much that I discredit the things that I have learned because sometimes I'll be talking to someone with ADHD or just a creative person, maybe a neurodivergent person, whatever, and they've really struggled to make anything happen, finish anything, whatever. And I can fall into just being like, yeah, me too. I'm exactly like that. And it can kind of almost be offensive because I've also published 10 books and, whatever other things that I've done. So that's one of the difficult things of talking about things like ADHD for me, where I feel like I'm not an expert at this. I'm an expert at being disordered. Like I am as disordered as it gets and disorderly. But obviously I've found a thing or two. So I think that, some of them are the most boring things, the things that nobody wants to hear, which, one of probably the biggest win for me was probably about a decade-long battle to get myself to run every other day. And that was a huge, even now, I'm not really sure what helped me crack that. Like, I don't know how. I know the process it took, but I don't really know. If I had to guess, and so I ran a little bit in college. I got into it, got hurt, then kind of like fell out of it. And then I spent like my 20 to 30 like trying to figure out how to get myself to have a habit. And I think, there's a lot of like research coming out right now about how neurodivergent people have a really hard time with habits because I'm no brain scientist, but what I heard was the cerebellum has, I hate throwing words around like that because I don't know what the heck it is. I just heard this. But what's somewhere in here, there's a part of it, this, meat bag up here, where you're supposed to be able to like automate behaviors. And for most neurodivergent people, that's just not something it does. It doesn't do that. Yeah. And so, like small talk is an example of that. Like small talk or brushing your teeth. These are things that are like command lines where you have a shortcut if you're a neurotypical. Just be like, Command T. That's just brush your teeth. And then you did it. And you're like 5 seconds, Well, I think it's supposed to be more than 5 seconds. 2 minutes later, you're like, okay, my teeth have been brushed. By who? I don't know. The automaton inside of me. I don't have that. Every single thing I do, I have had to have all these strategies on how do I get myself to do that, especially regular things. Yep. So running was the biggest one, and it took me a long time, but I've probably been running every other day for about 6 or 7 years. Oh. I'm bad with time, but something like that.
I'm bad with time.
And it's not an exact thing. There are days when, where it's like, it took me 3 days to get to it or whatever it is. But that one is like, now that I have it, I'm like, oh, if I take 3 or 4 days off, my mental health tanks in such a way where I'm like, I can't even believe that I ever tried to get by without this kind of thing. And I hate that piece because I think, man, the only thing I can say is that one thing that may have helped me do it easier is things like Atomic Habits. Only so much that applies to neurodivergent people, I think. But one thing that I think really does is break the habit down to the most small thing. Mm-hmm. Don't try to compound multiple habits. So for running, what I was trying to do was like, I'm going to run a mile every other day. I'm going to run a mile at this speed every other day. And you're like, those are 3 habits. That's running a certain pace, and running a distance. Those are 3 habits. And so what I think the thing that really helped me the last time, the thing that finally clicked was I have to run every other day. And I can run for 1 minute. I can run for 8 minutes. I can run at the slowest pace you've ever seen. But if I put my shoes on and moved in a running fashion, I can check the box. Nice. And then after 60 days of that, or, whatever, it's not a science, but whenever I start feeling like, like every time I go run, I kind of run a mile, then I'll add another piece where I'm like, okay, I've been doing this for 3 months. Now it's every other day I run a mile. And then that worked up to about 3 miles every other day. And then after that, I hit a wall. So I started to be like, well, what if it was 4 miles? Yeah. Eventually I was like, no, I don't like doing it that long. It's too boring. I don't have a runner's body really. So it's not really natural for me. So 3 miles has worked. It does the mental health thing mainly. Like that's the main reason. And that, I would say that habit thing, you can just apply it to anything else. Sure. The same is true for some people, ADHD people especially, but most creative people that struggle with kind of like getting themselves to do stuff will look at me doing a podcast for 10 years. And that podcast is a sequence of habits that is quite complicated. For sure. I do episode art. There is the copywriting of the title and the description. There's all this stuff. I won't bore you with it, but all these different pieces, and we do it every week. Yep. And for me, it doesn't feel like a crazy thing. Sometimes it really does break me. I'm not saying it doesn't, but it doesn't feel like I've done it. And and a lot of it's been positive. And I realized like, oh, the same thing was true where I started a atomic habit, a micro habit back in 2011 where I did a new character every weekday for a year. And that created this part of my personal practice where I'm always doing something for myself as a discipline, as a routine, not as a thing of when the inspiration strikes, Love whatever. That. And so after that project, I just started adding little complexities. So I think after that project, I started doing like an article that I illustrated once a week. And so the article is the writing plus the illustration that I added another layer. And then it became something that I'm recording. Now I'm recording and, writing, recording, and illustrating. And that just kind of compounded over time. And so I do think that's probably, I'm sorry, it's such a
No, it's great.
But that's how I think that method of like the atomic habit, that's James Clear. His book, but that little just like do one habit at a time.
I love that.
And know that habit if you're this type of person, is going to be the hardest thing that you can possibly do. So make it so small and strengthen that muscle and build up that over time.
Yeah, that's dope. I feel that. Like, there's things that I do now that you explaining that make more sense on why I'm able to do them every day. There's a habit that me and my family, because again, my wife's neurodivergent and then I am. And so we're trying to maybe like team it where we're like doing it together. So we've been trying to clean the house every day, because that's one of those things for my mental health. And I can tell for my son's mental health, it really does like weigh on us when the house isn't clean. So we've been trying to do the habit of like at 4:30 every day, we shut down and we all clean together. And we've automated Google to, hey, it's 4:30, time to clean the house, so that we can kind of like, again, piggyback on that task. And then maybe we get that done, great. And we're deep cleaning a part of the house because now the house is more clean.
Exactly that. And I think the discipline component of it is something that, I think creative people really value autonomy. Yeah. And I really do. That's why I've always wanted to be a freelancer. I've always wanted to be I wanted the freedom to integrate how I'm feeling and where I'm at and what I'm interested in. And so the discipline component has always been a difficult thing. But I think if you can figure out the main ones that you need to have inflexible, I think you got to get those locked in.
For sure. Yeah. So I'm going to jump into another question. I don't know if this is something that just came to my brain right now, so it's kind of a little ad hoc. But you've worked jobs before being freelance, right? Okay. So
a little bit.
How has your experience been having a job and having ADHD? I'm very curious about your experience here because I'm working through something.
Absolute nightmare. Okay. Absolute nightmare.
Okay.
Like that, honestly, like 90% of my life this far has been about avoiding traditional employment because it's just, it's the least conducive thing to being a person like me. I think luckily when I was a teenager, I watched my mom just be absolutely unemployable. And I think even if I fully didn't understand it at the time, I think by the time I was 17, I was like, even trying to do that a traditional way, I know it's going to end in disaster because I know whatever she's like, I'm like this.
Interesting.
And so I think I knew, and I'd already at that time tried to have like part-time jobs, and I did stick at them for extended periods of time, but they always wrecked me. I was always like so burnt out. I would make lots of bad decisions, self-medicating with all kinds of stuff. And that's pretty much how every long bout of employment went for me because I was just absolutely shot and, not doing a great job. Like every job I ever had, like whether it was at the movie theater or Subway or whatever, I was losing money, getting in trouble, like just unable to cope, feeling absolutely wrecked at the end of every single shift, dreading going in, everything about it. And, the thing that sucks, even as I'm saying that, it sounds like, oh, you're just a bad person.
Yes. Yes.
And the truth is, like, that's why I really love the concept of neurodivergence because it kind of emphasizes that this isn't necessarily a problem as much as it is a maladaptive way of being in our current society.
For sure.
Because there are plenty of other scenarios throughout history where being the type of person that we are was really adaptive. And that's the theory is that is why it evolved that way. If you're a hunter, being, hyper vigilant, noticing everything, that's going to be really useful to you. Not going to be useful when you just got to be an assembly line sandwich maker for 8 hours. No, that's like, you need to focus on the meats. That's it. Don't, I got in trouble there for getting too creative with the sauces. I was like trying to like almost sign my signature because they told me I was a sandwich artist. I was like trying to bring a little flavor, and they're like, 3 lines, Andy, 3 lines. And I'm like, okay, all right. So yeah. So I always, that was kind of, and actually that's why I make my podcast, Creative Pep Talk, is because, and that's why it's creative career. I think of it like two-thirds creative, 1/3 career. And so, but I always, and I always have a problem with that in a way, with the career aspect of it. Cause I am a creative at heart. I hate numbers. But the career aspect isn't necessarily because I'm like a business bro. It's because I care about creative people.
For sure.
And this is where the society we find ourselves in, and finding and crafting your own path is going to require you to be not just okay at business, but kind of great at it. And so yeah, that's where my passion comes from, is just knowing that the traditional route is not really great for a lot of people.
That's perfect, because that's also been my experience. Even because I was an engineer first, so I was working in like factories, and it was just so rigid, and I just did not. I felt it every day. I would go in, I was miserable. There was a lot of chaos in factories, so that my mind liked that, but just the monotonous stuff. They're like, well, you need to make a newsletter every month talking about what we're doing here, and I'm like, we're not doing anything. Like, I can't do this.
What? How about I just make one newsletter and we just send that one out every time, because it's a factory. Yes. So the same thing that happened this month happened last month. So there you go.
So I with my brain, I just get to the point where I'm like, I found a little hole for myself where I'd be like, give it 2 weeks, it'll disappear. So there's a lot of stuff I just wasn't doing because I'm like, I just can't bring myself to do that. And so now being a graphic designer, and like I worked in an agency for a little bit, and that still did not do it. I was getting in trouble for stuff that like I felt like wasn't my fault. It just was. There was moments where I could shine, but there was other moments where it was very difficult. Yeah. So it's just been one of those things where I'm like, am I really employable? Like, am I going to be able to work for anybody other than myself? And at this moment, I'm just exploring freelancing and doing work for myself, and it does scratch the itch. But like I said, there's other things you got to figure out, which I'm okay exploring those things on my own, but exploring those things under something where it feels like I have to give you more of my energy than you care to give me yours. And it just doesn't feel like a fair deal. So it's tough. Right now is I really feel for my other like buddies with jobs. Like I really do. I don't know. It's just a tough time. It feels like for jobs. Something I've been telling people is like, I really just wish we could be more creative in our approach to jobs and how we deal with people within them. Cause I feel like the biggest flaw is how we manage people. We don't manage people as people. And that's a lot of the problem. And then we're just kind of exploiting people. And of course, as we talk more about consent, and I'm talking consent to my son and stuff like that. Should people be doing things they don't 100% want to do? No. And that's, you know what I'm saying? So I don't know. There's a bigger conversation here. And that's why I kind of wanted to ask you how you felt about it.
Yeah. I mean, it totally makes sense. And in that vein, something that's really interesting is Cal Newport has a book, Slow Productivity. He was on my show recently talking about it. And that book's really great for people who run their own thing.
Oh, nice.
But
okay.
I think it's even better for people that manage other knowledge workers, which I would count creative people, designers in that sector. And the whole book is kind of about how our concepts of productivity all came from like agriculture and then agriculture to factory work. And then like knowledge workers or office workers and office managers adapted all of those concepts to knowledge work. And yet they're completely incompatible with the way that we work with our brains. Yep. And so everything we know about how a brain works, how a brain computes great output, these types of productivity actually are working against you getting those results.
Interesting.
And so I love that book. I love Cal Newport's work anyway, but I'm hoping that book doesn't come across just as a critique to managers, but would inspire them to try things differently because, especially, I mean, and also like, look, I get that there are lots of things that we have to do that we don't want to do. And I think there have been short seasons of that where I've been able to do it, even if it really did wreck me mentally and physically. And I get that we live in that kind of world, but also my hope, like yours, is that we would all find ways to express our strengths.
For sure.
In a way that feels great. But yeah, that book's really powerful, kind of rumination on those ideas.
I've been seeing it floating around, but I'm definitely gonna have to check it out.
It's great. Audiobook is really great.
Nice. Okay. So it's just this whole conversation, I feel like we're coming to, like, especially in the creative community, it's just kind of coming to a head of like we need to talk about these practices and like how this actually needs to work. So I'm excited I feel like as podcasters, we have the opportunity to have those conversations, which is really cool.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pivot and ask another question. I think it was, I asked people for questions this time, which I don't normally do. So I got a question from Amy Hood, and she was asking about, she was asking about how do you do your podcast every week without feeling jaded? How have you done it so long and been able to do it without feeling like you've done everything under the sun?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. Hi, Hood sisters. It's a great question, and there are definitely. I think the first part of it is just there are definitely seasons where I feel jaded.
For sure.
I think I never feel, but I don't feel like it's very, very rare that I feel like I don't have something to say, and that's embarrassing too. Like that's just.
I feel that though.
Like why?
I feel that. I'll talk about anything. You want me to get on the mic and talk about something? I'll talk about it.
Yeah, and it kind of reminds me of something Jerry Seinfeld said a bunch of years ago in some interview where he was like, you got to find out what kind of woodchuck you are. He talks about being a joke chuck.
Yeah.
And it's like, for me, you're going to have something that just flows through you.
For sure.
Like constantly. And it's kind of like your automatic behavior of your brain. And so... And so I think you just have to be good at like noticing what that is. Like, what is my brain doing? When my brain is in this scenario, that scenario, what is it doing? And I think for me, what it does is I get so much, dopamine or whatever, excitement, curiosity around new concepts. I love that. So I'm very addicted to finding those. It's such good, cheap, renewable fuel that doesn't have any negative cost on me like so much other, pleasure-seeking behaviors do. And so that's one that I've cultivated a lot. So I'm reading a ton of stuff all the time. I don't mean a ton of stuff like I'm a pretty active reader, but I'm not a fast reader. So it's not like I'm blowing through stuff, but I'm always consuming new stuff. I'm always pulling the thread. And then not only that, I think what my brain does is I want to find the abstract idea, the greater theory behind something. Mm-hmm. Like I can find myself always just naturally doing the thing of like asking the 7 whys. Like that's a concept that they do and like branding and all kinds of stuff. My brain just does that. I'm just like, why that? Why that? And I'm always kind of trying, like, I remember like having a really strong response to like the Matrix movies and Harry Potter movies and all this stuff. And I naturally was like, why? Like, what? It's not normal. The level of feeling that I have, what is this? It's so weird. And I'm like, oh yeah, I heard someone say it was kind of like the hero's journey.
Yeah.
I'm like, what is the hero's journey? So I'm going to read Joseph Campbell's book. And then I'm like, okay, well, what is it this? And that leads to Carl Jung's book. And this leads to all, and so I think I just have that. I think it's just a matter of channeling the natural behavior of your brain. And then you just have this thing of like, I just don't run out of that unless I'm really unhealthy.
For sure.
When I'm really like burnt out, that is when it kind of
it's hard.
Breaks down a little bit. Yeah. But I think finding the right cup for the kind of coffee that your brain makes, like that is a good, like that. And so the podcast container is such a good one for me because I just don't ever shut up. As you can see right here.
Hey, live. It works. You got to find the things that work. So this is, it works for you. I feel the same way. Yeah. Like, and sometimes I'll try to talk to a lot of mine is like, I'll see an advertisement or something and I'm like, dang, that was kind of clever. And I'll try to talk to my wife about it. And she's like, hey man, I really just don't care about this. And I'm like, all right.
That's great.
And podcasting and like creating videos and just has given me an outlet to be able to talk about those things that I do find interesting. So that is really cool. And I think, again, it ties back to the habit, like you've created a habit of showing up every week in podcasting. And that then also helps you with putting out the information that you are capturing in your brain. So it's like this thing that is probably helping you move through the world and make life like great, right? That's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and it reminds me, your description reminds me of the business concept of the the word just escaped me, but it's like it's kind of like it'll come back to me. It's I hate when this happens, but it's something like I don't know. I think it's a Jim Collins thing, but it's basically a word that means this thing leads to that, leads to that, leads to that, and it kind of works in a cyclical fashion, kind of like a water mill or something. And anyway, any of your listeners that know this concept are going to be shouting it out like it's this thing. I just can't remember what it's called, but I do think like all the stuff that I do, I'm trying to create this perpetual motion machine where this art or the podcast concepts inspire the personal work for the episode art, and the episode art leads to projects and books, and that stuff leads to new lessons, and those lessons lead to podcasts. And so I think that there's this word that I can't remember and it's going to come back, but when it does, I'll let you know. But it's that kind of thing.
Nice, yeah. And that kind of just probably keeps you going. That's dope. I've never thought about it like that. So that's probably again, it probably feels really good to be able to do that. You're like bringing in, getting out, like all at.
I looked it up.
Nice.
The flywheel.
There you go.
That's what it's called. The flywheel. Damn it. So close.
There you go. Okay, next question. Someone also asked, how long did it take to find your style as an illustrator, or did you always draw that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it took a long time. I think there is an innate way that you draw. There's two things that come to mind. Sure. One is you hear a lot about I feel like I've heard a lot of stand-up comics talk about how the first time they got on stage, the first couple times, they were doing things a certain way, and then they tried that style and that style and that style and all these different kind of ways of being a stand-up. And then eventually, when they really felt like they found their thing, it resembled a lot what they did the first time they got on stage. Now, I think that to me, there's a great story expert named Brian McDonald who he has a book called Invisible Ink, and he talks about Wizard of Oz. And I think I've actually heard this theory or this theme from a few different sources. I don't think it was maybe his invention or his noticing of this, but he said that The Wizard of Oz is about you have everything you need because, she had the ruby red slippers the whole time. And so I do think that's true, but I would add another layer to it because if you had everything you need, just as you are right now, just that first time you got on stage, then at the end of that movie, you would feel a little bit ripped off because you'd be like, okay, she had it the whole time. All of this was for nothing. It was all meaningless, but you don't feel that way, right? You don't, at the end of Wizard of Oz, you don't feel like, oh my gosh, this person is an idiot. Why? No, you're like, yeah. And so for me, I think the way I would think about, I love what Brian McDonald says about that, but I would think about it slightly differently where it's like the journey isn't to find something you don't have. It's to discover what you already have. And so I think that even though when you're a kid or when you start out, you have some of the raw material of your style, I think it's in the like drawing and the reps and the taste and the trying different things that it really kind of gets sharper. And I think that process probably never ends. But I do think like there were some like really intentional exercises of trying to find the patterns between my favorite artists, people like Tove Jansson, who created Moomin, Jim Henson, the creator of the Muppets, and people like Hayao Miyazaki. And even like Dr. Seuss, and I put all of those things on the same mood boards and tried to create collages and stuff with them even, and kind of notice what are the similarities. And it turns out there was tons of similarities, not just on the surface, but then symbolically, the kind of stories they're telling, that the themes and the images. And I used that as a jumping off point to create that first project I was telling you about, the daily character drawing. And then there were other layers too. But that, I feel like a lot of the stuff from that project ended up becoming quintessential to what I do now. But I also feel like I'm always still learning.
For sure. Yeah, that's interesting because I, especially about the stand-up comics and the first time they get up on stage representing, because I know, especially for me, when it comes to my illustrative style, there's for a long time where I just was like, what I do is not good enough, or it's ugly, or but look at these people over here who are doing art or art in a way where it's like, they're almost like a photocopy. Like they're able to draw things so perfectly and so clean. And for a long time, I pushed down like how I was supposed to make art and just wanted to copy other people. And I know people struggle with that a lot, and probably more with social media. When I was young, we didn't have that.
It's also just part of the process.
Yeah, for sure.
That's just part of the process. This is something that drives me absolutely nuts. Go read any biography.
For sure.
Go listen to all of your favorite creators. I don't know any of my favorite creators that didn't start out just copying their favorite things. I don't mean just like fully ripping off. I'm not saying bootlegging their stuff. I'm not saying that, but I am saying that most that you study will say, I was kind of a cheap copy of this thing that I loved.
For sure.
That's a part of the process. I really think, it's sad to me actually that we don't have the kind of, I don't think creative people have ever been well supported,
100%.
But I think that there were pockets of time with pockets of, the economic structure, where you could have, apprenticeships and patrons, and a huge percentage of what you'd be doing there and be supported doing would be copying the masters. And so I think we often attack and blame artists for being derivative, but what about the systems that don't allow for you to be bad for a little bit?
For sure.
You don't, even going to college and spending a few years being bad and being derivative and whatever, it's not free. It's expensive. And so I don't know, when I see someone coming up and I see them borrowing too much, even from me, of course I have And there are times where I've had like, a direct message that I'm just like, hey, this felt a little bit too much or whatever,
sure.
I'm not saying that there's a lot of nuance here, but I try to have a lot of grace for that because it's like, yeah, they were just like pushed out the nest and said, okay, what skill do you have? Oh, you make pictures? Boom, make a living. And it's like, okay, but it takes a long time
For sure.
of doing nothing that's good or worth anything.
Yep.
And we all stand on the shoulders of giants.
Yes.
Like, we're all going to learn from other people. Like nobody came out and just like, no one's ever seen this. That doesn't exist.
Yep. That's it. Yeah. And that's what's hard is like, it feels like there's this thing where it's like, well, I got to make money right now. And it's like, but you do have to be bad. And then I've also heard the concept of, have you had the concept of a taste gap where it's like, you might have really good taste and you like really love this thing, but you're not going to be able to put it out like that immediately. There's a gap between what you're going to be capable of before, and there's work in there before you have to get there. So I don't know. I just feel like there's more creative ways to kind of handle these situations of getting people from here to over here. And it's not just like, pay me $1 million and I'll give you a certificate.
For real.
But yeah, I'm just now getting back to being like, I'll illustrate now and be like, it reminds me of when I was a kid. Like the style really reminds me of when I was a kid, but it feels right. Like it finally feels like I'm doing something that's like what I want and like what I want it to be. So there's a little bit in there where it's like you kind of have to let yourself be yourself, and it's gonna be bad, and you will pick up things that are like this improves it, but I don't know. We just got to give ourselves probably grace and space. That's
And that's there's two other pieces that I think about. One is there are things that I made before that project that I look back and I'm like, I could have made this today.
For sure.
Like, but they were few and far between where I would land in those. But there's a handful of images that I made like in college or out of college, right out of college, where I'm like, that's exactly what I'm doing right now. Like almost exactly. Yeah. But the other piece to it is it kind of reminds me of, I love the concept of taste. I've done a lot of episodes about taste over the years, and I've put a lot of time and energy thinking about that, so I'm glad you brought that up. And one piece of it is the idea, like one of the things you see on all the like cooking shows is I like when Gordon Ramsay will be like, that's you on a plate. Like that's what you're looking for. And usually what that means is it is a combination of your background and your taste. And you've kind of taken where you've come from and you've elevated it with like an acquired taste, something that you've learned over time. And so I think that journey of the first time the stand-up gets on stage versus later, there's a lot of like integration of acquired tastes, nuance, and getting skill acquisition and really being able to do it. Because that first time you did it, even if you're in the style, even if you're being yourself, you probably aren't getting a ton of laughs.
Oh, yeah.
Like you still had to learn a lot to become, actually good at what you do.
For sure. Yeah. So that is, that's really, it's really, it should be freeing to know that there's this journey that you can take and you just have to take it at your own pace. And I don't know. I feel like a lot of people blame social media for like, we do compare ourselves to like, that's someone's highlight reel. Like that's the best thing they're ever doing. But it does also give us room to explore taste and to get under an understanding of what's actually out there. So that's, again, with the double-edged swords, there's such a duality to kind of everything that we do. So
yeah, there is. There totally is. But I think it's good. I do think it's good to be, especially when you're young in the journey, I think it's good to be excited, be a part of it, consume it, be all about it, make the Pinterest boards and the saved boards and all that stuff and just go buck wild and be obsessed because you won't be like that forever. True. Eventually that'll evolve into something different. Like I still do really like illustration and I really do. And I save a lot of stuff and I still am passionate about it, but it's not where my joy comes from in the work.
Yeah.
I think, so I think it's good. Like get all about it.
For sure. Okay. Next question. This is one that I got, I got a couple people ask. I wanted to ask you, do you get a lot of questions about your last name?
Yeah, because it's not my last name. It's a fake name. It's funny, man. Like it kind of happened on accident. I've told the story a bunch of times, but I just had my real name's Andy J. Miller.
Okay.
And you just can't get any good social media handles or websites, or you can't. They're like, my website used to be andy-j-miller.com. It was just a mouthful, and I hated it. And so I just thought, there was new suffixes that had just been dropped, and one of them was .pizza, and I love pizza. And I just thought, I'll just make my website andyj.pizza. That's all I thought it was a website.
Got you.
That's what I thought I was doing. And then everyone just assumed that was my name. And I was like, all right, whatever, man. I'm not that attached to Miller anyway. I've got family trauma and problems. Like, I don't even need to be Miller. Like, I'll be pizza. I'll start a new family heritage around eating pizza. And so yeah, that's kind of what happened. It's very authentic. I do love pizza. I've actually have, a complicated relationship with pizza because I love it too much. But yeah, that is kind of... I do get that question a lot. Like, are you really pizza? And I'm like, no. I mean, you are what you eat. So I'm like 98% pizza, but yes, not my real last name.
That's so fun. Yeah. That's awesome though. It does work. Like it works for you. And I feel like, that's a fun story to be able to tell. It's so funny when you pick those things, those random things that you're just like, I'm just doing this because I need to. And then it's like, okay, now I got to live with it. Like,
I don't know what your upbringing was like, but like in Sunday school, I remember like hearing these moments in like the ancient scriptures of where the divine bestowed upon this character a new name. And I was always like, I want that. But I wanted something like Rambo or something, awesome. And I actually fell into a giant pile of pizza. And you are now, you'll be pizza till the end of your days. So that's kind of what happened. And but I do think, just to turn it into something more juicy, I think even though it was an accident, I've kind of been blown away by how useful it's been. Yeah. Like, I actually think it gets, one of the concepts I think about a lot is the substance versus the packaging. And I think about it like the coffee versus the cup. Like the cup that the coffee's in changes your experience of it. You can think about it too, like wine in a solo cup. It's kind of cool for an offhanded occasion where like, we didn't even have anything. It just happened. Like, that's every once in a while, but you're not going to be like a wino going to a wine tasting and they're all in like red solo cups. Sure. And you're like, yes, smell the barnyard here. No,
so fancy.
That's not good. Yeah. It's not going to work. You got to pair the packaging and the essence and the substance. And I think that's where naming and branding actually really do matter, because if you think about what you drink liquid out of, how you interact with substance is so influenced by the packaging. And I never would have guessed how useful having that name has been. I do think it's made an impact, as dumb as it is.
Yeah, you seem like a pizza. Like it works for you. I am a pizza. Yeah, it works for you.
I know. It's maximal. It's like cheesy. It's me. That's me.
Yeah, it's awesome. I love that. I love branding and storytelling. So it's like, you're so right. Those things do matter. You can't go to a wine tasting and it be out of solo cups, because then why am I, like, I can go do this at home. So those things do matter, and we do have to think about them. So it's always funny when it's like you run across these companies who have not thought about any of that, and you're like, you sell this really fancy thing and it looks terrible, or like, sorry,
Yes.
but it does. But that's important. And so just having conversations with people in that way is something that I love to do, but they can be like really hard conversations because people are like, this is my baby.
Yep.
I don't want to give up my idea, but it is what it is.
Yeah, 100%. I think I'm always blown away by one of the greatest, I think, skills is being able to know your limitations. And I think you see this with the great leaders and managers. You got to think of someone who think of these people that have run companies that can't know anything about the actual hardware, the software, the engineering, the design, whatever. Like, it's a true, I think, visionary to know what you don't know and be like, oh, I don't actually know. Like, I don't know about this. And I think if you don't have that, you're kind of, if you're running a thing, I think you're kind of doomed.
For sure.
But yeah.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So this is the last question. I asked everybody this question. This is a podcast about creativity. So I always ask, what does creativity mean to you? And this is an open-ended question, however you kind of want to take it. And so all yours.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thing because it's something I think about a lot. Having done a podcast for 10 years called Creative Pep Talk, like it's creative focused. But the funny thing is, I don't know if you've ever had this, but like I've always considered myself creative. I always drew pictures and made stuff and whatever. But at the same time, the way the world thinks about creative people or creativity is almost not, I don't really think about it like that. I think in the West, we kind of equate creativity with originality. And I think to me, that's like saying food is about freshness. Like whether food is good or not is whether it's fresh. And you're like, well, yeah, but that's not, there's so much more to, there's the sustenance. There's the setting, there's every other thing around it. And I think in the West, I've heard, in my like little dives into creative research that I can't fully comprehend because I'm just an artist. But I've tried and I've listened to researchers, and I don't agree with everything they say, but one of the things they talk about, the working definition in a lot of creative research is something that's both novel, which is the originality component, like different, new, novel, and useful. And I know a lot of people, there's a lot of, like, some people love that definition. Some people hate it. I don't really care. I just find it as an interesting lens to think about this through.
For sure.
And I think for me, and I heard one of those researchers talking about how in different cultures, that spectrum of novelty to usefulness is valued really differently. So in the West, we really, really at least think that we value the novelty and the originality. And so when we talk about creativity, we're almost always talking about it through that lens of, I've never seen this before, man. Like that's kind of it's almost like we think that's the purpose of creativity.
For sure.
To me, I'm an ADHD, so I do need it to be a little bit fresh. I do need a little of that. I need it to be a little bit different, but I'm as interested in the usefulness, which is the sustenance side of creativity.
For sure.
Which is like, I need stories. I need them. And I actually don't like, a lot of the stories I love are the stories we've told a billion times. Like I loved Luca. And Luca is essentially the Little Mermaid. Okay. It's like, we have heard that story. Like, so to me, I think and maybe I'm just a contrarian where I'm like, creativity is about originality. Like, no, it doesn't even have to be original. Like, I don't know. Maybe it's that, but I do think when I think about creativity, I'm almost thinking about it through the lens of like, spiritual sustenance.
For sure.
Like we need creativity. We need to be creative. We need to consume and be immersed in creativity. Yeah, that's how I think about it.
Yeah, I love that. Do you think so? Again, with the newness, like, do you think there's a little bit of where it's like if it's not new, then you can't own it? Do you think it ties back to like maybe capitalism or something like that?
Yeah, I've thought that a lot, actually. Honestly, I think that there's a way in which a personal ownership of doing something that is deeply connected to your experience and knowing that it is deeply satisfying as an artist. And I think that should be your motivator to be original. I think it should come from, this is as authentic as it possibly could be.
Gotcha.
Like it's an expression of me. That level of originality, I think, is a good thing.
For sure.
But I also think it's a thing that happens over time in different amounts. But I think the way that we think about ownership and originality is almost completely based in economics.
Yeah, I agree.
And I think it's not really good for creative flourishing, the way that we think about it. If all of us had plenty of resources and the only thing that we cared about was creative flourishing, a story that's, even more interesting and even juicier and of the moment and all that, if we were doing that, I'm certain we would be sharing our ideas, not hoarding them.
100%.
So yeah, I like your point there.
Yeah. I always think about it that way because I'm like, well, especially the music industry, like it's a very much so where it's like, well, I own this and you can't touch it. And it's like, but think about where music could be if you could touch that song and make it better, and then that person could like touch your song and make it better, and it's like, wait, where could music be out of here? And like everyone could have like jumped on that band, and it could be such a good togetherness experience where we're just all growing and like being kind of one. But they just someone has to make $1, which kind of sucks. Like I kind of hate it.
Yeah, it does. It does. And it's, it's also, that's the planet that we're on, and it's part of the game and whatever. But there's a really good, again, another thing I tried to read, but only understood like 10% of it was this book. Man, what's his name? I can't remember what it's called, but it's, George Steiner.
Okay.
Real Presences.
Okay, nice.
And the book, I didn't read the whole thing. I read about a quarter of it, maybe third of it. He's like a very dense writer, philosopher guy. But there's a concept in that book that is just brilliant. It's about the idea, it's a make-believe world, a utopia that he's like saying, it's a place where no one is allowed to critique other people's work except for one way. The only way you can critique is by making a different version of the thing with the critique that you have. And he makes an argument that essentially that's at the core of all creative work. And then he kind of goes back. He's a literary critic as well. And he goes back through like the major, moments in literature and kind of shows how they can be seen as a critique of the previous great work and kind of draws a line through them. And I think that, to me, that's kind of what we're doing. Yeah. Like, we're trying to, ideally, eventually, the taste gap, the other thing that happens is hopefully you get to the point where nothing tastes good enough, like, because your palate is unique. Yeah. And so this is where taste comes in again, where you're doing a critique by making something different that's a little bit more, it's a little bit like these guilty pleasures you love, but they're also elevated with these like acquired tastes, and it's something that neither of them are quite doing right for your particular palate, and then you have the skills to actually do that. That's where I think that's where it gets really interesting. And that can only happen if you are comfortable being inspired by other people.
Yeah.
You know?
That's true. That is true. I love that.
Great questions, man. You got me talking, blabbering my freaking face off. So yeah,
It's what I do,
great,
man.
great job. It was fun.
I appreciate you being on. Where can people find you on the internet?
AndyJPizza.com. I'm on Substack, Instagram, and you can check out my podcast at creativepeptalk.com or just search Creative Pep Talk on whatever podcast player you use.
Nice. Is there anything that you want to plug? Anything you got coming out soon?
If you got kids in your life, your uncle, aunt, parent, teacher, whatever, I have a new book called A Sunday with Everything on it. It's a kid's book, and I've got a kid's book from pretty recently called Invisible Things.
Cool.
Those are kind of my bigger projects. And if you're I will say this other thing too, if you're neurodivergent or you have people in your life that are neurodivergent, or you have just a tricky time slotting into the society that you find yourself in, or you want to develop art that's more you, I have a series called Right Side Out on the show. It starts on episode 449, and it's 6 episodes, and there's an interview with my mom in there, and it's a really personal kind of one part memoir, one part self-help kind of podcast series. And it's up there, if not the top favorite thing I've ever made.
Nice.
So
I love that.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for being on. I had a great time. I'll have to catch you.
Thanks, Cam.
Catch you soon. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Creative Questions. Like, comment, or subscribe to allow us to keep making more episodes. I appreciate you for being here, and I'll see you on the next one.